Live from a halfway functioning studio, it is tonight's episode of the Horror Podcast. Welcome, new folks and old folks, to the wonderful Horror Podcast, where we take a movie and hopefully dissect it for how it can and cannot be used in the classroom. We are going to approach tonight's episode like we approach every episode. We are going to talk to you a little bit about what Oren and I have been watching and reading and discussing. We're going to bring you some free content on the internet in our dark corners of the web. And finally, we are going to discuss tonight's movie. But before we get there, Oren, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going. I bet it's going better for me than you, honestly.
Yeah, it's been one of those times, you know. I think this is my halfway functioning studio is an example or a repercussion of getting back to school and all of the nonsense that comes along with it. So
I guess it could be worse given that.
Yeah, right. Like if that's the only hiccup that we have, then I guess shit's okay, I guess. But we got these fancy new updates to hopefully help us teach Zoom, and as a result, my camera doesn't work anymore. If that's the update, I don't want it.
The update is no more cameras.
Right.
You guys.
Yeah, good luck, and you better not cough. So, yeah. So everything going okay in your neck of the woods?
Everything's going pretty good. Yeah. Just working, hanging in there. I don't have to go back to school, so that's good.
Yeah, that and here's the bottom line, Oren. I love the glasses. I think you've got your room all set because you're going to have to carry the image for everybody. We've got some folks showing up a little bit late. But yeah, my camera doesn't work today. So you get to look at all of Oren all class long. So lucky you guys.
All Oren all the time.
So what are you watching? What are you reading? What's going on in Castle Gray?
Well, so I was all excited because I actually read something this week, but I don't actually want to talk about that because I got in the mail Clown in the Cornfield. And so I'm about to start that. I got that literally today. And so I'm really excited to read that.
Hell yeah, dude.
That is next on my list. I'm super excited.
Yeah, it is fantastic. We I think Kyle reviewed it for Signal Horizon, but I read it too, and it reads like I don't know, kind of like a modern evolution of a Fear Street novel. Yeah. Because like it's written in this kind of YA style, but I would say it's way more clever, and more importantly, I think the thing that deserves all the praise is he writes like high school kids, teenage kids in such a real fashion. That's like my huge pet peeve. Like he's real with these kids, and I love that.
Yeah, I mean, like Adam's great. He's a good friend of mine, and one of the things, I mean, but before he and I became friends, I read some of his stuff, and one of the things that I always really liked about even his very early stuff is that he's very good at writing that feels, at a glance, it feels very simple. It feels very approachable, almost like pulp, almost like very, very mainstream feeling to it. But like, it's like you said, it's a lot more clever than that. There's a lot more going on under the hood than appears at first glance, and that very approachable exterior kind of lulls the reader very well, I think, and lets some of that deeper stuff get in there in ways that it wouldn't if the writing was itself more like dense.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. So, and that is Clown in the Cornfield. It's out and available now, and I think you can get it almost every place. We'll have a direct link to it in a bookstore that is not Amazon, if you would rather support a small business. But if you want to do Amazon, that's cool too. We'll include both links there. So, what else? Anything else?
I think that's. I mean, I think that's mostly been it for me. I started watching this like anthology film that's on Prime, I think. That's called Weird Fiction.
Yeah.
But,
Okay.
okay. In spite of the title, it does not seem to have much, if anything, to do with what we think of as weird fiction. It's just kind of a standard shot on video style, like 80s throwback horror anthology, but it's pretty good so far. I've only watched like 2 segments, but they've been pretty good. It's got like a very low budget, like Crypt Keeper type host. Like there's this guy in like pancake makeup in a basement being the host. But I mean, it's fun so far.
Okay, cool. I mean, I'm down to try almost anything, especially. I mean, here's the thing. I like anthologies, but if I'm being real, they've been real hit or miss this last year. So
yeah. I love horror anthology films, but almost all of them are real hit or miss.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's maybe like, half a dozen to a dozen like genuinely great horror anthology films, and all the rest are like a really good segment and some okay segments and a couple of not so good segments, and they don't gel into a really great film a lot of the time, but I still love them.
Yeah, that is more or less my take. Like I can usually find a vignette in every anthology,
right.
But I mean, I might have to go all the way back to like VHS or something like that to really find an anthology that I think is just strong universally, So
yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of the last like really good full-on anthology movie I saw. Like Scare Package was pretty good.
Yeah, it was okay.
Which I saw Panic Fest. It was pretty good. And before that, the Mortuary Collection that I reviewed for Signal was really good.
And that's playing right now at Fantasia. So.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's really good. If anybody gets a chance to watch it, however Fantasia's happening, streaming, I assume.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah, it is. It is quite good. So very good. Well, I have a couple of things that I'm super stoked for. Yeah. We had Jason Teal on last season. He sent me his like final proofed copy of his anthology, or not anthology, but his his book that came out. It's called We Were Called Specimens, an archive of the deity Marjorie. And it's awesome. It's a lot of fun. Really it's totally great. The cover of which I will show everybody next time is freaking cool as shit. So
if I'd been thinking I could have brought mine because I've got a copy too, because I wrote the introduction for it.
Well, you have great taste because it's really quite good. Yeah. And
I don't know about that,
but my newest review for Fantasia Fest is a movie called Alone. Oh. It is a movie directed by John Hyams, and it's a really tiny cast. It's got Jules Wilcox and Mark Menchaca. And I wasn't super familiar with Mark Menchaca. I don't even know if I'm saying his name right. I think I am. But he played Jack in the Outsider series that I loved. And he plays the bad guy, and he's just so malevolent, like he kind of plays this dopey, like not overly scary archetypal, like serial killer guy, but it's this like internal malevolence that he has that makes the movie fantastic. I'll include a link in the full review, but what I love about it is essentially the cast is just 2 people. It's the 2 main characters, and the female character's name is Jessica, and she's essentially running from who's credited just as the man through the whole movie, through about 90 minutes of it, but it's broken into 4 parts, and the 4 parts kind of represent the environments of which she's running from him. And it's just really well paced and really clever, and it's at least as of right now, it's my favorite movie coming out of Fantasia. So everyone, when it gets a wide release, and it will, because Magnolia is putting it out, make sure you check out Alone, because it's great.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, man. It the first part is just I think it's called The Road or The Highway or something like that, and it totally feels like traffic horror, like road horror. So like in the review I referenced that it harkens back to like Duel or the classics like Joyride, and I don't give a shit if anybody says that's not a classic. I love that movie, so it's so much fun, and yeah, so it's super great. Check it out.
Speaking of, I mean, not that, but like speaking of like really small, simple contained movies, I did finally get watching Host.
Oh yeah, what'd you think?
It was good. It was good. So the more than the movie itself. So I watched it. Grace was out of town, and I watched it really late at night because I tend to stay up too late when Grace isn't home. And so I watched it at like 1 a.m. or something, or midnight or something like that. And it's like an hour long, so it was over at like 1 or 2 a.m. And as soon as it was over and I shut it off, there was this loud on my ceiling. I shit you not.
So
I don't know what it was. I don't live in an apartment. I live in a townhouse. Like my ceiling, there's a roof above it.
So you got squirrels or something? Squirrels?
I guess. Bats? I don't know. I've never heard it any other time, so I don't know what it was.
Terrifying.
Yeah,
terrifying.
It was great.
Yeah, man. Like
the ideal compliment for that film.
I don't know what it is, but obviously we're gigantic horror fans, but when my wife goes out of town or she's not here, shit just gets scarier. And it's like, I don't like do I like in the subtext, do I think that she's going to protect me? Maybe. I mean, she's pretty badass, but like, I don't know. I turn into a child.
It's right, like another person gives us consensus reality, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Another person can tell us that was this thing, or they give us an anchor, something to bounce off of. When we're by ourselves, our imagination blows up and it's all the reality we have, really. We can't check against anything except our own experience.
Yeah.
So everything's scarier when you're by yourself.
Well, scarier by yourself, and like the bottom line is we are human beings, so like creatures of the night are like not necessarily our friends. Case in point, the family was by the family, I mean my 13-year-old son and my wife and I were sitting on the couch a few weeks back. It was like midnight. We were wrapping up whatever we were watching, maybe something spooky. I don't know. Keep in mind, I live in a neighborhood. All right. So like there's a neighborhood full of kids, full of whatever. It was a Friday night, midnight. All the lights are still on in the house. And the way my couch is situated, it's backed up right against the main window in my living room. And somebody ran up to my house and knocked on my window 3 times. And I'm sure it was like one of my son's friends who was out way past, but it scared the shit out of me. Yeah, man, it was brutal, but yeah. So yeah, that's what we're saying is we're going to review all of these amazing films, do all of this great analysis. But the long story short is just knock on some shit and Oren and I will be scared.
I mean, obviously if you just knock on some shit, most people will be scared. Like, look at, any number of movies, right? It's just people jumping out and yelling boo.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah, life is a jump scare. Dude, I totally fucking feel like life is a jump scare every time I look at Twitter lately. But,
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move to Dark Corners of the Web, shall we?
Yeah. I
have a really interesting dark corner that I'm super stoked about. So one of my pastimes, whether it be right or wrong, especially now that daycare is starting back up, the Unsel household does not have a ton of money. So I try to read what I can and find what I can for free, especially when it comes to Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year, Volume 12, because I know it's going to be a little while until I can get a copy for Signal Horizon. I know it'll be even longer to get audio versions of all of that. They're always spectacular, but it takes a while and it can be a little pricey. So I was able to track down one of Ellen Datlow's stories from Best Horror of the Year, Volume 12. And it is absolutely fantastic. It is part of the Ink Heist podcast. The name of the story is How to Stay Afloat When Drowning by Daniel Braum. And he comes on the Ink Heist podcast and essentially just reads the story. It's about 45 minutes long, and the story is out of this world fantastic. So
awesome. I've read some of Daniel's other stuff, and it's always been good. I've not read that one, but
it's got great atmosphere. Like it takes place in the seaside like town with a boardwalk and everything, which I'm already like totally in because of the environment.
Right, I'm 100% sold already. I'm done.
Right, but it's got mermaids. Like talk about untapped, like untapped potential, evil, scary, creepy mermaids, and it's just rad. It's super great.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it kind of taps into this weird machismo that comes with like like big fishermen, but like big fish. Like you want to go out and catch a marlin or whatever.
Fisherman type stuff.
Yeah. Like there's this deep masculinity that comes along with that like is not really my cup of tea, so I never really understand it and I always kind of feel a little weird around it, But I wouldn't say it makes fun of that, but it definitely uses that like hyper masculinity to help tell the story. So it's great. It's totally free, and you can access it through Inkai's podcast, which is great too. So it's awesome.
Cool.
All right, my friend, we have entered that period of time. I know you've been waiting a couple of weeks to discuss it, but before we get there, the essential question for tonight is going to be, what role does the old dark house play in the creation of modern haunted house horror tropes?
Do you happen to have any idea where we are?
I haven't the least idea in the world.
We've come to ask for shelter. We've lost our way.
What is it? What do they want?
They want to know if they can stay here for the night.
My sister Rachel had this room once. She died when she was 21. Bless, O Lord, this is the house. May they reprove a whole mankind. Amen.
Whose life? I suppose it's a store.
Here we are, 6 people sitting around. What do we know about each other? Not a thing.
I've got a funny feeling something dreadful might happen to us.
You don't seem to understand. We may be cut off, shut up in this house. There's a madman upstairs.
You shouldn't have come here. You see, it may be dangerous.
Oh, Philip, not something else horrible.
You're afraid, aren't you? You don't believe in God, and yet you're afraid to die.
So, those of you all that are not super familiar with the old dark house, I'm going to read you a brief summary, but I'll also tell you it is old enough that it's like everywhere for free. So, like, you can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it on Shudder, you can watch it wherever, pretty much for like no money. You can like stumble across a remastered version that will probably cost you some cash, but if you just wanted to check out the movie, there is a free version on YouTube because I believe it's in the public domain at this point. So
possibly, yeah. If it's still on Shudder, I don't know. I didn't check. The one that was on Shudder is the remaster that they did for Cohen Media, which is one of the best remasters I've ever seen. Like it restores the movie to it's amazing. Like modern movies do not look as good and clean as the Blu-ray Cohen Media remaster of The Old Dark House, which was the version that was on Shudder. So it's amazing.
Sweet. Awesome.
That one.
Well, and hopefully you all took advantage of the free 30 days you got from the Weird Symposium and can check it out. So hopefully you have some time left on your free trial and it'll be good to go. Okay, so here is what old Rotten Tomatoes, I would say it's not one of their longest, but certainly not one of their shortest. Here is their summary of The Old Dark House. Frankenstein director James Whale turned J.B. Presley's novel Benighted into a nerve-jangling tale, originally released in 1932, that became the template for all the spooky house chillers to come. Stranded travelers stumble upon a strange old house and find themselves at the mercy of a highly eccentric and potentially dangerous family. The atmospheric thriller features an unforgettable post-Frankenstein horror role for Boris Karloff as the hulking, disfigured butler Morgan. It also stars in early career roles of Melvin Douglas, Charles Laughton, Raymond Massey, and Gloria Stewart of Titanic fame. All right, so my question every time that you pick a movie, why this one? Why start here, Oren? What's the significance of The Old Dark House?
It is not even probably. It's my favorite movie from the 30s, hands down, 100%. Like, I know intellectually that like Frankenstein or definitely Bride of Frankenstein, or Dracula are probably better, certainly more important movies, but everyone's seen them also. But I love this movie. I love the atmosphere of it. I love the comedy of it. I love the themes of it. I adore everything about this movie. It's perfect as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's it's fair. I would say it's not my favorite thing in the entire world, but like knowing your aesthetic, this is probably the thing that formulates a lot of your opinions,
I think it's aces. I love this movie.
So have you read the book that it's based off of? Okay,
so this is good stuff. So the book that it's based off of, I actually helped get back into print. So Valancourt Books, you are familiar with Valancourt Books. Back when they were still here in Kansas City, I brought to them the idea that they should do Benighted and bring it back to print. And so when they did, I got to write the introduction for the Valancourt edition of Benighted. So if you pick up the Valancourt edition, I wrote the introduction for it. It was the first introduction I ever wrote, in fact.
I love that. How cool is that? So how did that conversation go specifically? Were you just so familiar with it all that you were like, hey, we got to do this?
So I had read the book. So I saw the movie a few years ago, and I loved it so much that I tracked the book down via interlibrary loan from some old, probably the last time it was in print, so probably like the 60s or something, edition, like a hardcover old, like cloth bound edition, and read it there, and I loved the book, which is both really close to the movie, but also really different in some ways, and its own whole thing, and I loved it too. And so when I was talking with the guys, when I learned that Valancourt Books was based in Kansas City, I was like, okay, I have to talk to these guys. So I was talking, I struck a conversation with them anyway, and had talked to them several times. And we were just talking one time, and I was like, what book you should do? You should totally do Benighted. And they did, and ended up doing a bunch of other J.B. Priestley books as well.
I dig it.
But yeah, it was just kind of this is absolutely the kind of book you guys do. It's this sort of classic Gothic book that's out of print.
Yeah. Well, and that is immediately, like, I had two responses to this movie kind of right off the bat, right? Mm-hmm. The first response is like always that kind of tingle in the back of my brain when I'm like, dude, like, this is totally something that you could show. I probably wouldn't show the whole thing to a high school class because like it wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't hold their interest for 90 minutes. But if I were teaching Gothic literature or something, like, duh, like this is, a no-brainer. But what I also like, the first 10 minutes of this movie are like fucking hilarious. They're really funny, and the relationship between the kind of two leads, right, the male and the female, are like funny and sardonic, and they have a real, I think, natural way of communicating with one another that reminded me a lot of the way I talk to my wife, or like whatever. Like they kind of give each other shit in a loving way, and it reminded me of a movie. Have you seen Haunted Honeymoon?
I actually haven't.
Oh, all right. So Haunted Honeymoon and a couple of other flicks, I think, have this. They are definitely like horror comedy, right?
Right.
I think the other one that I really love is a movie called Nothing But Trouble, which is, yeah, like they kind of invert the idea of the haunted house. They make it comedic, right? And almost always have this kind of setup that feels like like we've seen the movie 1,000 times, and it was so crazy to me that like kind of this movie is like the pre-code version of everything that everything that comes after it. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, I mean, and like Nothing But Trouble definitely, like consciously, I think, is inspired by this movie, like, and other movies like it. But I'm sure the people who made Nothing But Trouble had seen this movie.
Oh yeah, and it the use of age as a way to villainize, and that kind of stuff. It gosh, I haven't seen that movie in probably 20 or 30 years. I need to go back and revisit it.
I haven't either, and what I remember clearly is that it is real fucked up.
yeah, that's like I hesitate to say I loved it. I did though, like, but that was like, I don't know, 12-year-old me, right? It was like,
but like it also kind of disturbed 12-year-old me in a way that I wasn't used to comedies doing.
Yeah.
Even like comedies, like even horror movies, like it made me uncomfortable.
Yeah. Like the one thing I remember from that is like the old guy is really rapey, right? And I'm like, that probably is not going to hold up super well,
And like Dan Aykroyd is like 20 people in it or something. Mm-hmm. Dan Aykroyd plays like everyone.
Yeah, except Demi Moore. Yeah. Oh, what a strange what a strange little film. Okay, so I mentioned pre-code, right? And when you do some background and research on this movie, the fact that it is pre-code is really, really important in explaining its role at the time and kind of how it influenced stuff later on. You are the master when it comes to this older stuff. So can you talk to us about what pre-code as a concept means and how it kind of plays in with the larger idea of modern movies?
So pre-code refers to movies that came out before the enforcement of everybody just calls it the Hays Code, but it was actually the Motion Picture Production Code. We call it the Hays Code because it's shorter, and it's named after the guy who was the president of what became the Motion Picture Association of America. It wasn't called that then; it was called something else, but it became that. And the Hays Code was like, so the government. There were a lot of complaints about movies and about the content of movies, and specifically about like horror movies and crime movies, about how they were corrupting our youth. The same old thing that we get about comic books or rock and roll or video games or something every few years. And the government was talking about censoring them, essentially, passing some kind of law regulating what could be in movies. And so in order to prevent that, the Motion Picture Association voluntarily did it themselves. Essentially, they said, no, you don't have to censor us, we'll do it. And so they came up with this Hays Code that was like, here's what cannot be in movies. And I mean, we could talk about the Hays Code and pre-code cinema and all that stuff for way too long. But the gist of it was that, before the code was enforced, movies were a lot weirder and more daring and more risque than they were after. And the code was technically passed in 1930, but it wasn't really enforced until 1934. So you've got this kind of weird window of about 4 years where movies like The Old Dark House or Dracula or the original Frankenstein all came out during, where the code was technically passed, but no one was enforcing it yet.
Yeah.
And just you get like, it's not like older pre-code movies they're not graphic by modern standards, and they're not even direct by modern standards, but they deal with themes in ways that movies would not for 30 years. Again, like something I put in the notes was Island of Lost Souls, which was the first ever adaptation. It wasn't actually, it was a silent one that I missed, but it was an early adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau. And it deals really frankly for a movie from the 30s with like the fact that Dr. Moreau's plan is to get the guy he's got shipwrecked on his island to breed with the animal people. And
as one does, right?
You know, right? And it deals really frankly with like vivisection and just this stuff that movies wouldn't touch for years after this. But right here in this pocket of time, right in the very beginning of the 30s, you had these movies that were dealing with these much more kind of risque and frank topics.
Yeah, well, and like one of the things when you dig into this movie that it really highlights or that bears discussion is how it approaches homosexuality, how it portrays this kind of latent, the latent sexuality of all of the characters, but specifically a couple of the main characters, one of which you've talked about in a previous episode, right?
Probably. Which one are you talking about?
I shouldn't say character. I should say the director, right? Like James Whale.
James Whale, yes.
Yeah, like that's kind of a hallmark, right? Right before this movie, I believe he made Bride of Frankenstein, right? Right before or right after?
Right, was right after. This was in between Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, I think.
Okay, and like he does the same thing with that that, like, he's not going to have a character that's out, but there's kind of a character that's out in this movie, right?
Ernest Schlessinger's characters are like coding. They're not even coded. Yeah, they're just gay.
Yeah. Like I don't think anybody asks, but I don't think anybody has to. Like it is a thing that happens, and I think that plays an important role in pre-code, post-code discussions, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, like a lot of that stuff. It's not like they ever say it. It's not like it's ever spelled out, even the pre-code stuff most of the time. But it is there as subtext in a way that it's not once the code comes into effect. Like they skip over it. They tend to skip over it. I mean, there were directors who were pushing the envelope even while the code was in effect. But
yeah, well, and the big example in one of my film classes that I took in college, like the big example of post-code discussions of homosexuality had to be so much more disguised, right? And it had to do with Rebel Without a Cause and Heathcliff, right? Like clearly there is a relationship that is in the subtext of that, but because it's post-code, it's got to be so much more subtle, right? It's got to be done with camera angles, and it's got to be done with like a lingering shot on somebody looking at someone else, as opposed to both of these films that I think are having that discussion in a pretty open and frank manner, which I think is incredibly progressive for the era, right?
Well, and you get and it's not just that discussion either. Like you get a much more, again, they never say it, but a much more frank discussion of like the chorus girl character's relationship to Charles Laughton's character, where she clearly acknowledges that everyone assumes that they're having sex,
right?
But explains that they're not because he's still in love with his dead wife, essentially, and but also basically says that she would. She's like, yeah, she says something like, I'm not pretending like I'm any better than I am, or something like I would do something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just not right now. And she's not judged for that. Like, that's fine. She's still the romantic lead.
Right. Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think kind of alludes to what we've kind of been nibbling at the corners about, which is like there is some hokey shit in this. There is some, kind of boilerplate tropey stuff that is important probably for where horror movies are now, but at the time kind of feel a little, aged or whatever.
Mhm.
But I think the relationships all of these characters have together with one another, I think is really complex and laudatory and really, really interesting because it drives, all of the action of the film.
Right. One of the things that it's not drawn out as much in the film as it is in the book, but it does get mentioned in the film, is the idea that basically all of these characters who end up at this house, like the people in the house already, are artifacts from the past, essentially, right? Like
Right.
they're leftovers from a bygone era. People who show up are modern people for the time,
Sure.
And all of the modern people who show up are people who are essentially adrift in the life for some reason. And the reason that they're all adrift is because World War I just ended.
Okay.
And the really fascinating thing about both the book and the movie is that, like, World War I cast this huge dark shadow over both. But both happened before World War II was going on. And yet that future, that very dark future, is there really emphatically in the book, even though it hasn't happened yet. Like, even when the book was written, World War II had not started yet. At the same time, you can feel it waiting in the wings, like the author expected it.
I love it. Interesting.
And so, like, it's very much this story about these people trapped in this liminal space between these two wars, one of which has not happened yet when the book is even being written.
Huh. Well, and
fascinating stuff.
Yeah. And I think it alludes probably to the larger role this movie plays with the horror genre in general. It kind of, it doesn't, I don't think we can say it's solely responsible for like haunted house films. Like I think that's a big ask for this movie, but I definitely think it brings some of the modern tropes. And you mentioned the liminal space between the two wars. Like, a haunted house is itself liminal space, right? Like it is this thing that is both of Earth, but of, of supernatural stuff, So
and it's a house almost always. In modern days, we've gotten, like, after Poltergeist, we've gotten more houses where this was not the case as much. But in old stuff especially, it was usually an abandoned house that was haunted, right? And the abandoned house is a house that is both in the present and the past at the same time.
Yeah.
Which this house also is. Like, it's always in the present because people arrive at it, but all the people living there are still living in the past.
Yeah. Well, and like, they're old. There's not not a single person in that house. So there's this whole generational conflict that I think is really, really interesting too,
They are old, and, like, each one of them is trapped in some way by events from the past.
Oh yeah. I like that.
And also, like, the house itself is very old and isn't updated, so, like, the electricity doesn't work very well.
Right.
It's not a modern house. It's a house that's struggling to be as modern as it is, and it's not very modern then. There's also, like, again, in the book, there's a lot of subtext that Morgan is a relative, not the butler.
Oh, interesting. I think that completely.
He's like an illegitimate half-brother. You get a little bit of it in the movie with his relationship with Saul.
Yeah. Well, and that completely, I think, adds a fundamentally different angle, right? If he is not just help, but also deranged family, like, I love the idea that the original members of the old dark house, right, are all trapped in the old dark house by somebody fundamentally different, like there is not a unifying force, right? There's not this one thing that they can all unify and get behind and whatever. Like they are all compelled by, different reasons to stick around.
Right.
So I want to talk for a moment about, and I don't remember the character's name, but I'm 100% sure you will. The patriarch, right? The grandfather that lies in his deathbed, right? Roderick
Fenn. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So originally billed as a male, we know in retrospect, not a male, right? Female.
Right. Yeah.
And to me, the way that character is played reminded me really, really distinctly of the character that Tilda Swinton plays in the Suspiria remake.
Yeah, I could see that. Yep.
And like, I didn't necessarily love that sequel. I don't know, this is going to be the unpopular opinion here. Please don't send me 1,000 emails about it. But like, I'm not a Giallo guy, so like the original, I was like, yeah, it's like horror royalty, but I don't get it, right? So the remake was really interesting, and I thought did some super interesting things about gender roles and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But why cast that role as as why have a female play that role? And like, what do you think is the overall importance of that character generally for the movie?
Man, I mean, the obvious answer is that the character provides exposition, right? The character knows what's going on. That's the simplest answer. But there's got to be a reason, like why we have that big scene with them, and why James Whale cast a woman, to play this role. And like I mean, I've seen various theories, and I'm sure someone has written a very smart, whole article about it, probably many of them that I haven't read. But I've, knowing what little I do about James Whale, I mean, I feel like it was partly him getting away with stuff again.
Yeah. That's it. That was my immediate thought.
Like I can. This is a situation where I'll be able to cast a woman as a man, and
because I can.
That will mess with people a little bit, but they won't be sure. Like, because this was in the day, I mean, this was in the age not only before the internet, but like this was early days of film, right? So film was still magic tricks to a huge extent. And so a really good example of this, right, is that when this movie came out, Boris Karloff gets high billing in it, even though he plays a character who never speaks and who isn't prominently featured really in the film. But when it came out, like part of the promotional campaign was Universal like assuring audience members that this was the same guy who played Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
And that sort of underscores this idea that like we wouldn't necessarily know, if people were under heavy makeup or something, we wouldn't necessarily know who they were, aside from their credit in the movie, which they didn't always get. We didn't have unions enforcing credit rules yet, and so people didn't always get credits in movies. It was kind of all over the place. And so, if people were under heavy makeup, which, people like Lon Chaney had kind of made a career out of disappearing under makeup,
right?
You wouldn't necessarily know who they were. And so you would have had people back then being like, was that, and since it's credited as a man, like it's got a man's name and it's supposed to be a male character, was that a man? And people would be like, no, that was totally a woman. And then no one would know for sure, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like it was just kind of James Whale, having fun and poking his finger at gender roles a little bit.
Yeah, and like it adds a layer of complexity and weirdness to that role, and it
makes the character feel strange and kind of otherworldly.
Yeah, and frail, and like I think terms generally associated with femininity, but also with the frailty of age, and
Right.
I think it works really well in that
and she's
context.
great. I mean, the actress is fantastic playing it. Like the pauses and the stutter and everything she gives the character is amazing. Just a really delightful role.
Yeah. So we've talked about The Bride of Frankenstein, and very clearly the Old Dark House. Is there anything to add to the kind of the patronage and the legacy of James Whale? Because I feel like he is an interesting figure in both the evolution of horror movies as we know it, but also in the discussion of like the fact that horror movies themselves can often be these great way to critique particular, the things about society, ideas, whatever.
I mean, I think given within the sort of limited window we have here, I think a thing that's worth saying is that if you're interested in James Whale, there's a biopic of him from 1998, which I find fascinating because in it he's played by Ian McKellen.
Oh, awesome!
And for one thing, Ian McKellen obviously also like James Whale, gay, but if anyone could kind of ape Ernest Thesiger's very arch, very fey deliveries, I think it would be Ian McKellen.
Yeah.
That very like bitch queen gayness that Ernest Thesiger just radiates.
There's this great article from BFI that describes his character in this movie as bitchy and eye rolling, which I fucking laughed out loud when I read it, because he is totally that way, like he's great.
And it's widely agreed upon that like Ernest Thesiger, every time he's in one of James Whale's movies, is basically a stand-in for James Whale. Like he's playing the externalized, person James Whale kind of wants to have been.
I love it.
Be nearly that open.
I love it. So, do you remember what the name of that biopic is?
It's called Gods and Monsters.
Okay, great.
It's got Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser.
Cool.
It's directed by Bill Condon. So
sweet, great. Well, I'll try to hunt down where you can find that. Hopefully, free on some sort of streaming service.
Yeah. I'm sure.
Okay, so there are a lot of tropes that this movie kind of ushers in that are still with us, and you put this really interesting article in the show notes here, Oren, about kind of the way that those movies function within those tropes. You want to discuss a little bit kind of how the Old Dark House preps us for all of that, and then kind of issues a real conversation about those concepts, or doesn't necessarily fit that definition?
Okay, so the first thing I have to talk about is like the Old Dark House as a genre, right? Because a lot of people, when they talk about this movie, they talk about it as though it is sort of as though it was like the first movie or something in this, but it absolutely was not. Like the Old Dark House subgenre was incredibly popular in the 20s and 30s. It started out in stage plays. It moved into films when, because most early films were adapted from stage plays. It was very popular partly because it had one set, essentially, right? You're in one building, more or less, the entire time. But like the classic Old Dark House movie is actually more like a Scooby-Doo episode than this is. It's a bunch of people end up gathered in a house like this, which this part does have that. A lot of times it's for the reading of a will. That's like the most common one.
Okay.
And they all have to stay in this house for a duration of time for whatever reason. It's, dark and stormy night, or they have to stay for the reading of the will, or whatever. And as they're staying there, they start getting knocked off. They start getting killed. by what appears at first to be like a monster or some sort of cloaked figure or a ghost, or in some cases it's an animal like a gorilla or something, but eventually it's revealed that it's actually one of the people there, like it's one of their number who's doing it. And that's the sort of standard Old Dark House formula, and there are hundreds of them from the 20s and 30s.
Would it be fair to say like movies like House on Haunted Hill and
Absolutely
13
Absolutely.
Ghosts also kind of?
Yeah. I mean, they are definitely, like, they're later, but they're definitely in that same genre.
Yeah,
they're picking up that same genre and running with it. Long after it had stopped being the kind of ticket seller that it was in the 30s. But no, there's I can put some of the show notes, but there's literally hundreds. There's the Cat and the Canary and the Bat. There's the Monster Walks and Night Monster. Just countless movies. To the extent that there's a Blu-ray set you can buy that's like all Old Dark House films or something. That's 100
cool.
movies.
Wow.
I mean, they're all garbage. Like, they're all public domain. Terrible. Like, they're fine movies, but the prints are terrible.
Yeah.
Whatever. But there were, like, we remember the 30s as the era of like Frankenstein and Dracula and Mummy and stuff, but they were the anomalies. Most horror films in the 30s were these formula Old Dark House movies, which they just made, a dozen a year or something.
Yeah. Probably reuse sets and
Right, yeah.
more or less plots.
And so this film is actually kind of anomalous in that regard, because it came out after these had already been popular and begins like one, but then spins out into something different.
Yeah, I think that's fair. A little more complex, and it's got
Right.
a little more going on with it. Yeah. I might add, it's really crazy that we are having this conversation about this style of horror movie tonight, because I don't know if you've been following Lovecraft Country, but you totally should, because it's fucking awesome. But so starting in episode 2, the episodes really start to revert into this like different subgenre every episode. And some of that is because Matt Ruff has written it that way, but some of it is that they really have like gone for it. And episode 3, which comes out this Sunday, I'm still under a strict embargo, so I can't, tell you too much about it, but I will tell you it is an Old Dark House episode, and it is so fucking rad. And like my immediate response was, this is like 13 Ghosts, right? Like it kind of captures the feeling of it all in the kind of claustrophobia, while at the same time keeping with it the edge that it has. So if you like any of these movies, try to figure out a way to watch the new episode this Sunday, because it is so good. Good.
So something I do want to talk about, since we're talking about sort of how the Old Dark House influenced later films, and this may be jumping the gun a bit, but an interesting thing for me is that so you have the sort of classic Old Dark House formula, like I just described, which obviously went on to influence things like Scooby-Doo episodes and movies like 13 Ghosts and House on Haunted Hill. But then you have this actual film itself, and I think what's fascinating to me is that the movies that this film directly gave rise to, right? I don't want to say influenced, like the most direct lifeline between this movie and a present day movie goes to movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, House of a Thousand Corpses. Not any of the movies we would initially think of.
Yeah. You want to explain that connection a little bit more?
So essentially, right, what this movie is about is these people, these innocent victims, which interestingly is itself kind of an anomaly for movies from this era. People in movies from this era were not typically random victims in horror films. They were people who put themselves in that situation on purpose for whatever reason.
Huh. Okay.
The random people being victims did not come about until after the 50s. In movies leading up to the 50s, the people who were the protagonists in horror movies were experts or paranormal investigators or people who were directly involved in the phenomena in some way. Most of the time. Like, even in the old Dark House movies, there would be like the female lead would typically be like an heir who had, you know, been away for a long time and she was the innocent victim one, but like around her there would be like a detective who was there because something suspicious was going on or whatever. Like, there would be these experts who were professionals at dealing with this kind of stuff. And so this is anomalous in that these people are just random people.
Okay.
In this situation.
Yeah.
So you've got this group of random people who end up at a house of a deranged family where they are put in immediate peril by those family members, right? It's essentially the plot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's just much more tame and genteel.
Yeah. And like latently, right? Like, I don't know if they ever explicitly go into it, but like all of our strangers are urban, right? And there's some passing reference to their urbanity. And these people very clearly, you know, the people who live in the house are very clearly not. And
they're from out in the country. They're Welsh, which matters if you're from Britain, I assume. Like, but I think it would be, you know, I think it would be the way it's written about in the book and the way they talk about it in the movie. It would be like, you know, it'd be like going out in the boonies, right? Like, right. They're in Wales. They're not in you know, the urban part of England.
Yeah. Well, and they almost have a Romani aspect to them, you know, like there's this kind of, and it may be Christianity. I'd have to go back and look for it, but this kind of orthodoxy about the older sister, right?
Absolutely,
the matriarch now of the household, that feels old school, that feels foreign, feels not contemporary. So
and like to sort of demonstrate that this is not just me theorizing about a movie I really like.
You would never do that.
in House of a Thousand Corpses, there's a scene at the beginning where they're watching TV, and what they're watching is this movie.
No way! How cool! Yep. All right.
So like it is very, like, Rob Zombie is very clearly drawing from this movie in that one.
Rad! I love it.
And so, like, you know, as much as I'm not a big fan of like House of a Thousand Corpses or something, like it's fascinating to me that like we have these, like, as you said, this movie is to modern standards. It's creaky and it's very like cozy and very genteel and very restrained. But its evolution leads us to like the most grotesque and unrestrained.
Yeah, no, I think.
And also, since you brought up Lovecraft Country, it's fascinating because the Lovecraft story, the picture in the house, also goes like straight to Texas Chainsaw Massacre and House of a Thousand Corpses. If you ever read Picture in the House, it's like it's very odd for a Lovecraft story because it's just like this guy goes to this house and the dude there's a cannibal.
All right.
It's way less. I mean, it deals with cosmic-y themes, but it's way less, you know, tentacles and unnameable monsters. Way more like, this dude eats people, which, to be fair, was something Lovecraft wrote about a lot. But
yeah, interesting.
But yeah, so like, anyway.
Yeah, I to be fair, I found this movie charming. It maybe not quite as much my cup of tea as it was yours, but I am better for having watched it because I had not watched it yet, which is a lot, you know, like I just have shitty pedigree when it comes to that.
Honestly though, a lot of people haven't seen this one because it's not, like, it's partly because it's not as sort of well regarded as like Bride of Frankenstein, right? Or the movies that were right around it.
Right.
But also for decades it was lost.
Right. Yeah. I kind of fell into some of that. There was a re-release in the 60s, I think, And
when Chris Harrington discovered it, I believe.
Yeah.
Which is another fascinating thing is that director Curtis Harrington, who made Night Tide and Queen of Blood and a bunch of other schlock movies in the 60s, is the guy who rediscovered a print of this. So like he's who we have to thank for this movie being in existence at all now.
Which is unbelievable. Like that's crazy. Yeah. That it would just stumble across it. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you and I liked it. We are not the only ones. So this person happened to not like it. And this is our anonymous Amazon user in the back of the room. And he says, I went into this expecting an old black and white horror movie. What I got was an old black and white movie that consisted largely of people being passive aggressive at each other in an old house, which I guess is about as good as I could hope for. Which I like that is kind of this movie. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right. But my runner up here is the half a star on Letterboxd. Okay. And the only comment from this half a star was, yeah, ... pretty gay.
That it's hilarious to me because that could easily also be my 5-star review of this movie.
Yeah, right. Like, yes,
Yes, this movie is extremely gay. 5 stars.
Yeah, right. Like, it is, especially the world in which you and I exist in, where we believe that horror should be like uber transgressive and should absolutely push boundaries, and like you'd be like, yes, that is a reason to go out and catch this movie for sure. So, well, anything left to be said about the old dark house?
I mean, countless things, but I think we're pretty much out of time. So,
very fair, very fair. Well, where can they find more of your stuff out on the web?
As always, I am Oren Gray on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and at orengray.com.
Very good. You can find more of my stuff. I tweet into the void about horror movies and politics and horror movies at Ty Unsel. Otherwise, I'm kind of running the day-to-day at Signal Horizon Magazine. Feel free to check out all of our Fantasia Fest coverage and kind of everything else that we are covering. I will say before we end tonight's episode, I think it's really important to recognize what is going on in the world right now. And I think I briefly thought about, it feels weird to talk about horror movies when the world is on fire. But I'm a teacher, and a lot of the folks on staff here at Signal Horizon are teachers, and we all start back to school here in 2 weeks. And the thing that has been dominating my brain is how I teach to my students of color. And it's just really important, I think, to make the announcement to let everybody know that at Signal Horizon, we absolutely believe that Black lives matter, that Black students matter, and that horror is hopefully one more way that we can go fight those bad guys, because there are a lot of bad guys out there in the world. And, part of the job of teachers is to train our students to go out and fight the good fight. So we support all of you out there that are fighting the good fight, and we hope that you'll join us in 2 weeks. What are we talking about in 2 weeks, Oren?
I believe we are going to talk about One Dark Night.
One Dark Night. We're going to keep in theme and move from Dark Night to Dark Night. This time jumping ahead to the 80s in another movie I haven't seen, but I am so incredibly jazzed to check out. So
your notes about it.
Yeah. I think I'm like legitimately very excited to check it out. So until we meet again, everybody, please take care of one another. Please continue to watch horror. And if you would like to communicate directly with me, you can absolutely do that. Tyler at signalhorizon.com if you have some recommendations or whatnot. So until you hopefully see me again, class dismissed.
There wasn't a woman of skin and bones. Ooh. She lived down by the old graveyard. Ooh. She went to the closet to get a broom. Ooh. She opened the door and